The war had been going on for 3 long years, and humanity was losing very badly across all the outer colonies and space stations that humans had built over the decades of expansion into the galaxy. And now, the enemy fleets were sitting right above Earth itself like dark clouds, waiting to strike the final blow that would end everything. Captain Maya Collins stood on the command deck of the huge orbital station called Horizon, and she was watching the massive alien ships that belonged to the Dominion as they drifted through space like enormous mountains made of metal and darkness against the backdrop of countless stars. And her hands were shaking slightly as she held onto the metal railing in front of her because every screen and monitor around the command center showed the same terrible truth, which was that Earth had only a few hours left before the attack would begin, and maybe even less time than that. The Dominion had crushed every human defense force that tried to stop them, and they had vaporized every outpost and space station that got in their way, and they had killed millions of people already. And now they were here at Earth ready to finish what they started, and there was nothing left that could stop them, or so everyone thought. Lieutenant Kate was working at her station nearby, and her fingers were moving quickly over the controls, but her face showed how scared she was. And suddenly, she looked up with wide eyes and called out to the captain that they were receiving some kind of transmission, coming through on all the channels at once. Maya turned around fast and asked where the transmission was coming from, because if it was from the Dominion fleet, then this might be their surrender demands, or worse, it might be them telling Earth that the attack was about to begin right now. Kate checked her screens again and shook her head while saying that the transmission was not coming from the Dominion fleet at all, but from somewhere else entirely. And the source was unknown, but the signal was incredibly powerful, and it was coming from somewhere beyond the moon, which made no sense because there was nothing out there that could send a signal that strong. Maya felt her heart beating faster as she ordered Kate to put the transmission on the main screen, so everyone could see what this was about, and the large display at the front of the command deck flickered for a moment with static, and then an image appeared that made everyone in the room stop breathing for a second. She was tall and beautiful in a way that seemed impossible, and her skin had a faint glow to it like silver moonlight, and her ears were long and pointed, sweeping back from her head in elegant curves, and her eyes were deep and ancient like forests that had existed for thousands of years. And she wore armor that looked like it had been grown instead of made, with flowing curves and edges that seemed to be made of crystal. Behind her, and only partially visible in the transmission, was something enormous with scales that gleamed in shades of deep red and bright gold and eyes that burned like molten amber. And even though only part of it could be seen, everyone knew immediately that it was a dragon, and not just any dragon, but one that was truly massive. The woman on the screen spoke, and her voice had strange harmonics to it that seemed to bypass the speakers completely and go straight into the minds of everyone listening. And she said that she was Empress Seraphine of the Eternal Realm, and that she had traveled very far across the galaxy to reach Earth, and she was looking for someone specific, and that person was Lieutenant Daniel Hayes of the Human Defense Forces. Maya felt her blood turn cold in her veins when she heard that name, because Daniel Hayes was her younger brother, and he was not on the station with her, but down on the surface of Earth in the ruins of what used to be the city of New Seattle before the Dominion had bombed it 2 weeks ago during one of their earlier attacks. Kate looked up from her console with shocked eyes and confirmed what Maya already knew, which was that Daniel was stationed on the surface as a field medic, helping the wounded survivors in the ruins and trying to save as many lives as he could, even though the situation down there was desperate. Maya stood frozen for a moment, trying to understand why an alien empress who commanded what looked like an entire fleet of advanced ships, and who had a dragon as her companion, would cross the entire galaxy, just to find her brother, who was just a simple medical officer, and not anyone important in the military command structure. But there was no time to waste thinking about it, because if this Empress Seraphine wanted to meet Daniel, Then Maya needed to get down to the surface immediately before anything else happened, and she started moving toward the exit while shouting orders to Kate to get a shuttle ready for immediate launch to the surface. Kate started working on that right away, while Maya ran through the corridors of the station heading for the shuttle bay, and her mind was racing with questions and worries, because she had no idea what this meant or whether it was good news or bad news, but she knew that she had to get to her brother as fast as possible. The shuttle bay was busy with people running around and preparing for what might be the final battle, but Maya pushed through the crowd and got into a small, fast shuttle that was used for quick trips down to the surface. And she started the launch sequence herself without waiting for a pilot because she knew how to fly it and there was no time to waste. The shuttle launched from the station and accelerated toward Earth, and as Maya flew down through the atmosphere, she could see the Dominion fleet above her like a dark ceiling covering the sky, and she could see the scars on the planet below where cities had been destroyed and forests had been burned, and she felt anger and fear mixing together in her chest. She flew the shuttle toward the coordinates where Daniel was last reported to be in the ruins of New Seattle, and as she got closer, she could see the devastation more clearly with buildings that had been knocked down and streets that were filled with rubble and smoke that still rose from some of the wreckage, even though the bombing had happened weeks ago. Maya landed the shuttle on a clear patch of broken ground, and she jumped out before the engines had even fully shut down, and she started running through the ruins calling out for her brother, while her boots crunched on broken concrete and shattered glass. She found him sitting on a large chunk of concrete that had once been part of a building, and his medical kit was beside him, and he was just staring at nothing with empty eyes, and his uniform was torn and dirty, and his face was covered with ash and dried blood, though she could not tell if the blood was his own or from the people he had been trying to save. Maya ran up to him and grabbed his shoulders and shook him gently while saying his name over and over until he finally looked at her and seemed to recognize her, and she saw how exhausted he was and how much pain was in his eyes from all the death he had witnessed. Before she could say anything about why she was there or warn him about the transmission from the alien Empress, there was a sound like thunder that made the ground shake, and both of them looked up at the sky. Something massive was descending through the clouds, and at first Maya thought it might be one of the Dominion ships coming down to attack. But then she saw the shape more clearly and realized it was the dragon she had seen in the transmission, and it was even bigger than she had imagined with wings that seemed to block out the sun as it came lower. The dragon landed with tremendous force about 100 meters away from where Maya and Daniel were standing, and the impact sent dust and debris flying in all directions, and the creature folded its enormous wings against its body and lowered its head to look at them with one huge eye that held intelligence and power that was frightening to see. Riding on the shoulders of the dragon between its neck and wings was Empress Seraphine, and she slid down from her position with grace and ease like she had done it 1,000 times before, and her boots made no sound at all when they touched the rubble-covered ground. The dragon stayed where it was but kept watching Daniel with that enormous amber eye, and Maya could feel the weight of its attention like physical pressure in the air around them. Seraphine walked toward them slowly, and her armor caught the dim sunlight that filtered through the smoke-filled sky, and she moved like water flowing over stones with perfect balance and control, and she stopped about 10 paces away from where Daniel and Maya were standing. Daniel had gotten to his feet, and his hand had moved automatically to the weapon at his side, though Maya did not think that a pistol would do much good against a dragon or an empress who commanded fleets of advanced warships. Seraphine looked at Daniel for a long time, and her ancient eyes studied every detail of his face, and his torn uniform, and his exhausted posture, and Maya watched as something like recognition and pain, and joy all mixed together, passed across the Empress' face. Then Seraphine did something that Maya would never forget for as long as she lived, and something that would be talked about across the entire galaxy for generations to come. the Empress of the Eternal Realm, who commanded thousands of worlds and millions of soldiers and fleets of ships that could destroy planets slowly and deliberately, knelt down on the broken concrete and rubble of destroyed Seattle, and she bowed her head low in a gesture of deep respect and submission. Behind her, the massive dragon also folded his legs and lowered his body to the ground in a mirror of his companion's submission. And the sight of these two impossibly powerful beings kneeling before a tired human medic in a ruined city was something that seemed to break all the rules of how the universe was supposed to work. Daniel Hayes stood there frozen in shock as he stared at the kneeling Empress and her dragon, and his mind could not process what he was seeing because none of it made any sense at all, and he looked over at his sister Maya, who seemed just as confused and surprised as he was. Seraphine kept her head bowed for several long seconds, and then she spoke, and her voice was soft but carried clearly across the ruined wasteland, and she called him my lord, which made Daniel feel even more confused, because nobody had ever called him that before, and he was just a medical officer, and not anyone important. The Empress said that she had searched for him across the stars and through time itself, and that the debt her people owed to him could never truly be repaid, but she was offering him everything she was and everything she commanded, and she said that his enemies were now her enemies, and his war was now her war, and she was his to command. Daniel finally found his voice, and he said that he did not understand what she was talking about because he had never met her before, and he did not know anything about any debt, and he asked her to please stand up because having someone kneel to him felt very wrong. Seraphine slowly rose to her feet, and as she did, the dragon behind her also stood up and shook its massive body, and Daniel could feel the ground vibrate from the movement, and he realized that this creature was even more powerful than he had thought. The Empress walked closer until she was only a few steps away from Daniel and Maya, and now they could see her face more clearly and see the tears that were running down her silver cheeks and leaving trails that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Seraphine said that she understood he did not remember, but that she remembered everything, and she began to tell a story that seemed impossible, but her voice carried such conviction that it was hard not to believe her. She said that 500 years ago, by human time measurement, she had been just a child, and her world had been attacked by a terrible enemy, and her family had been killed, and she had barely escaped on a refugee ship with other survivors from her planet. The ship had been damaged badly during the escape, and it was drifting through the empty void between stars and slowly dying, and everyone on board knew that they would not survive much longer because the life support systems were failing, and there was not enough oxygen for everyone to make it to where they might be rescued. Then a human ship had found them floating in space, and this ship had been lost itself because it had been thrown through time by an accident with an experimental faster-than-light drive that humans had been testing, and the crew of that ship had been trying to find their way back to Earth. The medical officer on that human ship had been named Daniel Hayes, and he had worked desperately to save everyone on the refugee ship. But there was a terrible problem, which was that there was not enough oxygen in the rescue pods for all of the survivors to make it to the emergency beacon that had been activated. Seraphine said that she remembered Daniel Hayes from that time as a young man with kind eyes who had moved quickly through the refugee ship, checking everyone and trying to save as many as he could. But when he realized there was not enough oxygen, he had made a choice. He had taken off his own oxygen mask and given it to young Seraphine, who had been barely 200 years old at the time, which was very young for her species, and he had told her that she had her whole life ahead of her and that she deserved to live, and then he had stayed behind on the failing ship. Seraphine said that she had been placed in a rescue pod with other survivors, and as the pod carried her away toward the beacon, she had looked back through the small window and seen Daniel Hayes sitting peacefully in the cold, airless ship, as frost began to form on his uniform, and she had watched him die so that she could live. She said that in that moment she had made a vow by all the old magic of her people, and by the dragon bond that connected her to that, she would never forget the human who had saved her, and that if she ever had the power to do so, she would repay that debt no matter what it cost. Daniel listened to this story, and he felt his head spinning because he knew he had never done any of those things, and he said that it was impossible because he was only 28 years old, and he had never been on an exploration ship, and he had certainly never traveled through time. Seraphine nodded and said that she understood his confusion, but that time was not a simple straight line that only moved in one direction, and that, for some people, and in some places time could bend and loop and cross over itself in ways that were hard to understand. She said that the Daniel Hayes who had saved her might be him from the future, or might be him from a different timeline, or might be some version of him that existed in a way that was beyond normal understanding. But what mattered was that she knew his face, and she knew his heart, and she knew his name. When she had heard that Earth was under attack by the Dominion fleet, and when she had learned that a human soldier named Daniel Hayes was serving as a field medic in the defense forces, she had known immediately that this was connected to the man who had saved her, and she had gathered her fleet and come as fast as she could. Maya, who had been standing quietly listening to all of this, finally spoke up and asked what Seraphine wanted from Daniel now, and whether this was some kind of trick or trap. Seraphine turned to look at Maya, and her expression was completely sincere, and she said that this was no trick, and that what she wanted was to help humanity survive the war against the Dominion, because she could not stand by and watch the people of Daniel Hayes be destroyed when she had the power to stop it. She said that she had brought her entire fleet, which was hidden in a dimensional fold just beyond the moon, and that her ships were more advanced than anything the Dominion had, and that her dragon warriors and her own magic could turn the tide of the battle. Daniel looked up at the sky where he knew the Dominion ships were waiting, and then he looked at the massive dragon who was watching him with those intelligent amber eyes, and then he looked back at Seraphine. He said that he did not understand any of this, and he was not sure he believed in time travel or alternate timelines or any of it, but that Earth was dying, and millions of people would be killed if someone did not stop the Dominion, and if she was really offering to help, then he would accept that help. Seraphine smiled for the first time, and it transformed her face from something ancient and sad into something beautiful and warm, and she said that she was glad he would accept her aid, and that she would make the Dominion regret ever coming to this system. She turned and walked back to and placed her hand on the dragon's massive leg, and the dragon lowered his body so she could climb back up to her position on his shoulders, and once she was settled, she looked back at Daniel and Maya. Seraphine said that they should return to their orbital station because the battle was about to begin, and that they would want to see what happened when the Eternal Realm went to war, and there was something in her voice that was both exciting and terrifying. The dragon spread his enormous wings, and with one powerful leap, he launched himself into the air, and the wind from his wings knocked Daniel and Maya backward, and they had to shield their eyes from the dust and debris that went flying everywhere. As climbed higher into the sky, Daniel and Maya ran back to the shuttle, and Maya started the engines while Daniel strapped himself into the co-pilot seat, and they lifted off from the ruined surface and headed back up toward the orbital station. During the flight, Maya kept looking over at her brother and asking him if he really thought that story about time travel was true, and whether he really thought this Empress Seraphine could be trusted. Daniel said he had no idea if any of it was true, but that the dragon was definitely real, and the fleet she mentioned was probably real too, and right now Earth needed any help it could get, even if that help came from mysterious alien empresses with impossible stories. As they approached the Horizon station, they could see that something was happening in the space beyond the moon, because reality itself seemed to be rippling and tearing open like fabric being pulled apart, and then ships began to emerge from the tiers in space. The ships that came through the dimensional tiers were unlike anything humanity had ever seen before, and they were not made of simple metal and circuits like human ships, or even like the dark angular vessels of the Dominion fleet, but instead they looked almost alive with flowing organic curves and surfaces that seemed to shimmer with inner light. There were dozens of them at first and then hundreds, and they kept coming through the rifts in space, until a whole fleet surrounded Earth like a protective shield, and each ship radiated power that made the Dominion vessels look like primitive toys by comparison. At the center of the fleet was the largest ship of all, and it looked like a castle made of living crystal and growing wood, suspended in the void of space, and towers rose from its surface with windows that glowed with warm light. And Maya knew, without being told, that this was the flagship where Empress Seraphine ruled her realm. Admiral of the Dominion fleet was watching all of this happen on his tactical displays, and his four hearts were beating faster with something that might have been fear, though he would never admit it to his crew, and he demanded to know what these new ships were and where they had come from. His tactical officer worked frantically at the controls trying to get information, but the sensors were having trouble reading the new vessels because they seemed to phase in and out of normal space, and their energy signatures were off the scale of what the instruments could measure. Then a transmission came through on every Dominion channel at once, and it overrode all their security and communication protocols as if they were nothing, and the face of Empress Seraphine appeared on every screen throughout the Dominion fleet. She was sitting on a throne that appeared to be made of ancient wood that was still alive with leaves growing from its arms, and beside her stood Daniel Hayes, looking uncomfortable in his torn uniform, and behind them, both through massive windows, was the head of the dragon, who could be seen clearly now in all his terrible glory. Seraphine spoke, and her voice carried through every Dominion ship with perfect clarity, and she introduced herself as the Empress of the Eternal Realm, and she said that the Dominion had made a grave mistake by attacking a world that was under her protection. Admiral tried to respond, and he said that the Eternal Realm had no business interfering in Dominion affairs, and that humanity had invaded Dominion territory first, which was a lie, but he hoped it might make the Empress hesitate. Seraphine's eyes flashed with anger, and she said that she had already reviewed all the Dominion attack records and communication logs, and that she knew the truth, which was that this had been an unprovoked war of conquest from the beginning, and that the Dominion had come to Earth seeking to enslave or destroy humanity simply because they could. She said that such cruelty and aggression would not be tolerated, and that the Dominion fleet had one chance to retreat immediately or face the full might of the Eternal Realm, and she raised one elegant hand as if to emphasize her point. Behind her opened his massive jaws, and fire poured out, but not randomly into space, but into some kind of focusing array that was built into the flagship, and the ancient dragon fire was converted into a beam of concentrated energy that blazed across the distance between the two fleets faster than thought. The beam struck Admiral flagship dead center, and the shields that should have protected it meant nothing against the power of dragon fire enhanced by Eternal Realm technology, and the flagship exploded in a ball of white-hot plasma. Consciousness transferred automatically to a backup command vessel as his body died, and he found himself gasping for breath in a new clone body, while alarms blared all around him, and his crew shouted in panic. The Eternal Realm fleet surged forward, and the organic-looking ships moved with impossible grace and agility, weaving through the Dominion formations like schools of fish moving through water, and their weapons were unlike anything the Dominion had encountered before. Beams of pure silver light lanced out from the Eternal Realm vessels, and wherever they struck, Dominion ships simply ceased to exist, as if they had been erased from reality, and other weapons fired projectiles that phased through shields as if they were not there before exploding inside enemy hulls. Small fighters launched from the larger ships, and these fighters seemed to be living creatures made of crystal, and they moved so fast that the Dominion point defense systems could not track them, and they tore through armor with claws made of energy. But the most terrifying thing on the battlefield was himself, who launched from the flagship with Seraphine riding on his back, and the dragon flew through space as easily as if it were air, and everywhere he went destruction followed. His claws, which were each as large as a shuttle, ripped through hull plating like it was paper, and his fire, which was the ancient primal flame from the dawn of time, melted battle cruisers into slag in seconds, and his roar, which could be heard even in the vacuum of space, somehow shattered the systems of smaller vessels. Seraphine sat calmly on the dragon back, and she directed him with gentle touches and whispered words, and together they moved through the Dominion fleet like a force of nature that could not be stopped or reasoned with. On the horizon station, Maya and Daniel and Kate, and all the other crew members watched in stunned silence as the battle unfolded, and human ships that had been preparing for a desperate last stand now found themselves spectators to a one-sided slaughter. The Dominion fleet, which had seemed so powerful and unstoppable just hours ago, was being torn apart by the Eternal Realm forces, and no matter what tactics the Dominion commanders tried or what weapons they used, nothing seemed to work against these strange organic ships and their impossible technology. Admiral finally accepted the truth, which was that his fleet could not win this fight, and that staying here would only result in the complete destruction of every ship under his command. And so he gave the order that he had never thought he would give, which was to retreat immediately at maximum speed. But Seraphine was not done with them yet, and her voice echoed across every Dominion communication channel again, and this time her words carried a warning that would be remembered throughout the galaxy for ages to come. She said that the Dominion forces were being allowed to leave alive so that they could carry a message back to their leaders, and the message was simple and clear, which was that humanity now stood with the Eternal Realm as allies and friends. She said that any attack on humanity would be considered an attack on the Eternal Realm itself, and that any threat to Earth or its colonies would bring down the full wrath of forces that had existed since before the Dominion species had crawled out of the mud on their home world. She said that the Dominion should consider very carefully whether they wanted to make an enemy of a realm that had endured for millions of years and had magic and technology and power beyond their comprehension. The Dominion fleet fled, and ships that could barely fly limped away from Earth as fast as their damaged engines could carry them, and they left behind the wreckage of hundreds of destroyed vessels floating in the void. As the last Dominion ship vanished into faster-than-light travel, Seraphine and returned to the flagship, and the Eternal Realm fleet took up defensive positions around Earth and the human orbital stations. On the horizon station, people were cheering and crying and hugging each other in relief and joy, because they had been saved from certain death, and their world had survived when all hope had seemed lost. Maya turned to her brother and saw that he was not celebrating, but was instead staring out the window at the Eternal Realm fleet with a troubled expression on his face. She asked him what was wrong, and Daniel said that he did not understand why all of this had happened, and why Seraphine had crossed the galaxy to save him, and whether her story about time travel could possibly be true. Before Maya could answer, a new transmission came through, and this time it was a private channel requesting that Daniel Hayes come aboard the flagship to speak with the Empress, and Maya insisted that she would come too, because she was not letting her brother face this alone. A shuttle arrived from the Eternal Realm flagship to transport Daniel and Maya, and when they boarded it, they found that the interior was nothing like a human shuttle, but instead had walls that seemed to be made of living wood with soft moss growing in places and lights that glowed from crystals embedded in the ceiling. The flight to the flagship took only a few minutes, but during that time, Maya kept asking Daniel if he was sure he wanted to do this, and whether they could trust Seraphine, and Daniel said that he honestly did not know, but that he felt like he needed to understand what was happening. When they docked with the flagship, they were met by attendants who appeared to be elves like Seraphine but younger and less powerful looking, and these attendants bowed deeply to Daniel, which made him feel very uncomfortable, and they guided him and Maya through corridors that seemed impossible. The hallways curved in ways that should not work according to normal geometry, and sometimes they could see outside through windows, but the view showed different parts of space than should be possible from where they were walking, and plants grew from the walls, and ceiling filling the air with pleasant scents. Eventually, they came to a large observation deck that had windows stretching from floor to ceiling, showing a view of Earth hanging beautiful and blue in the darkness. And standing at the windows looking out was Empress Seraphine. She turned when they entered, and she had changed from her armor into a simpler dress made of silver fabric that flowed around her like water, and her long hair was loose now instead of bound up, and she looked younger and more vulnerable than she had during the battle. Was too large to fit inside the ship corridors, but they could see him through the windows coiled on the outer hull of the flagship, and one of his massive eyes was watching the observation deck with that same ancient intelligence. Seraphine invited them to sit on benches that appeared to be grown from the floor rather than built, and she sat across from them. And for a moment nobody spoke, and the silence was heavy with unasked questions. Finally Maya broke the silence and asked what Seraphine wanted from Daniel, and what would happen now that the battle was over, and whether Earth was safe. Seraphine said that Earth was safe for now, because the Dominion would not dare attack again, while the Eternal Realm fleet was protecting it, and she had already sent messages to other hostile powers in the galaxy warning them that humanity was under her protection. She said that what she wanted from Daniel was harder to explain because it was not about demanding something, but about offering something, and she needed him to understand the truth about what had happened between them across time. She began to explain that time was far more complex than most species understood, and that the universe had many layers and many possible paths that events could take, and sometimes those paths crossed and intersected in ways that seemed impossible. She said that in her long life, which had already spanned over 700 years, she had learned that destiny was real, but not in the simple way that most people thought, and that some meetings between souls were meant to happen regardless of the obstacles of time and space. The Daniel Hayes who had saved her 500 years ago had been a man from Earth Future, who had been thrown back through time by an accident with experimental human technology, and he had appeared in the past just in time to save the refugee ship where young Seraphine was dying. That Daniel Hayes had known somehow that he was going to die, and that he would not be able to return to his own time, and in his final moments, he had told young Seraphine that she should live a good life, and that she should never forget that even strangers could show kindness to each other. Seraphine said that she had built her entire philosophy of rule around those final words, and that when she had eventually united the scattered kingdoms of her people and become Empress, she had made it her mission to protect the weak and to show kindness even to strangers. She said that over the centuries she had searched for any information about the human who had saved her, and she had found records of Earth and its location, and she had learned the human languages and studied their culture, but she had never made contact because she was waiting for the right time. When she heard about the Dominion attack on Earth and learned that a Daniel Hayes was serving in the defense forces, she had known that this was the moment she had been waiting for, and whether this Daniel was the same one who had saved her or a different version from another timeline did not matter because the debt was still real. Daniel listened to all of this, and his head was spinning with confusion, and he said that he still did not understand how he could owe her anything when he had never done the things she was describing. Seraphine smiled sadly and said that he was thinking about time in a linear way where the past came before the present, and the present came before the future. But that was not how time really worked at the deepest levels of reality. She said that perhaps in a few years or a few decades, Daniel would volunteer for an experimental mission and would be thrown back through time and would save her, or perhaps in some parallel timeline, a version of him had already done it, or perhaps the act of her coming to Earth and saving him now would create a causal loop that would ensure he went back to save her. She said that trying to understand it logically would only lead to madness, and that what mattered was the connection between them, which was real regardless of how time had twisted around itself. Maya, who had been listening quietly, suddenly asked if this meant that Seraphine expected Daniel to go on some kind of time travel mission now, and she said that she would not allow her brother to be sent to his death. Seraphine shook her head quickly and said that she expected nothing of the kind, and that she would never force Daniel to do anything, and that in fact she hoped he would never have to make the sacrifice that the other Daniel had made. She said that she had come to Earth not to collect on a debt, but to prevent Daniel from ever having to pay it, and that by saving his world now she was breaking whatever causal loop might exist and creating a new timeline where he could live a full life. Daniel looked at her for a long moment and asked what she really wanted from him, and Seraphine hesitated and looked down at her hands, and when she spoke again her voice was softer and less certain. She said that in the months since she had learned about Daniel and decided to come to Earth, she had been thinking about what it would be like to meet him, and she had built up this image in her mind of the man who had saved her. She said that now that she had met him, she realized that her feelings were more complicated than simple gratitude or duty, and that she found herself drawn to him in ways that she had not expected. She said that she knew it was strange because they barely knew each other, and because she would live for thousands of years, while he would only live for decades, but that she had learned over her long life that connections between souls were rare and precious, and should not be ignored. Daniel did not know what to say to that, and he looked over at Maya, who seemed just as surprised as he was. Seraphine stood up quickly and said that she did not mean to make him uncomfortable, and that there was no pressure or expectation, and that he was free to return to his life and his duties, and she would continue to protect Earth whether he wanted anything to do with her or not. But Daniel also stood up, and he said that he wanted to understand more and that maybe they could spend some time together and get to know each other properly, instead of just dealing with debts and destinies and time travel paradoxes. Seraphine's face lit up with a smile that made her look truly happy for the first time, and she said that she would like that very much. 3 months had passed since the day Empress Seraphine had arrived at Earth and driven away the Dominion fleet, and in that time many things had changed both for humanity and for the galaxy as a whole. Daniel Hayes stood in one of the beautiful gardens aboard the Starlight Palace, which was what Seraphine called her massive flagship, and around him grew flowers in colors and shapes that Earth had no names for, and some of them sang softly when the wind touched them, and others glowed with bioluminescence, even in the daylight. From where he stood, he could see Earth through the transparent dome overhead, hanging like a precious blue and white jewel against the black velvet of space, and he never got tired of that view, because it reminded him of how close his world had come to destruction. Lay coiled nearby in a section of the garden that had been designed to accommodate his massive size, and one of his great amber eyes was open and watching Daniel with what seemed like amusement. And over the past months, Daniel had learned that the dragon was far more than just a powerful beast. The dragon was Seraphine, bonded companion and equal partner, and he possessed intelligence that was easily the match of any species in the galaxy. And he could speak directly into minds when he chose to, though he preferred to remain silent most of the time and simply observe. Daniel had spent many hours talking with and learning about the ancient bond between dragons and elves, and how it was formed, and the dragon had told him stories about the early days of the Eternal Realm that went back millions of years. The alliance between Earth and the Eternal Realm had been formalized 6 weeks ago, in a ceremony attended by leaders from both civilizations, and humanity had gained access to advanced technology and magical knowledge that would have taken them centuries to develop on their own. In return, humanity had offered their own unique perspectives and innovations, because even though human technology was less advanced than the eternal realm, it was based on completely different principles, and the engineers and scientists from both civilizations were excited about what they could create together. The ruins of cities like New Seattle were being rebuilt with help from Eternal Realm construction teams, who could grow buildings from living materials in a matter of days, and the human colonists who had fled the outer worlds during the Dominion attack were returning to their homes. Maya had been promoted to admiral and given command of a new joint fleet that combined human ships with Eternal Realm vessels, and she had thrown herself into the work with enthusiasm, because she believed strongly in the alliance. But perhaps the biggest change had been in Daniel himself, because over the past 3 months, he had spent almost every day with Seraphine learning about her culture and her people and her long history, and somewhere along the way, he had fallen completely in love with her. He heard soft footsteps behind him and turned to see Seraphine approaching through the garden, and she wore a simple dress today in shades of green and silver, and her long hair was braided with living flowers, and she smiled when she saw him. She came to stand beside him, and they looked out at Earth together in comfortable silence for a while, and Daniel still marveled at how natural it felt to be with her despite the enormous differences between them. Finally, Seraphine spoke and said that she had been thinking about the future and about what would happen as time passed, and Daniel felt his heart sink a little because he knew what she was going to say. She turned to face him and said that she had to be honest with him about something that had been troubling her, which was the difference in there, because she would live for thousands of years, while he would only live for perhaps 100 if he was lucky. She said that she cared for him deeply, and that these past months had been some of the happiest of her long life, but that she worried about what would happen when he grew old and died, while she remained young. Daniel had been thinking about the same thing, and he said that he understood her concern, but that he had also been talking with some of the Eternal Realm healers and scientists about possible solutions. He said that there were treatments available that could extend humans significantly, and that while he would never live as long as she did, he might be able to live for several centuries instead of just decades. Seraphine's eyes widened with hope, and she asked if he would really want to do that, and if he had thought carefully about what it would mean to watch his friends and family age and die, while he remained relatively young. Daniel said that he had thought about it a lot, and that it would be hard, but that the alternative of only having a few decades with her before dying seemed much worse, and that he wanted as much time with her as he could get. She reached out and took his hands in hers and said that she felt the same way, and that she had been so afraid to hope that they could have a real future together. But now it seemed possible. They stood there holding hands in the garden, while watched with his ancient amused gaze, and Earth turned slowly overhead. Daniel said that there was something else he had been thinking about, which was the time travel paradox that had brought them together, and whether it was something he needed to try to fulfill. Seraphine shook her head firmly and said that she had been consulting with the greatest temporal theorists in the Eternal Realm, and they all agreed that the timeline had already been changed by her intervention. She said that the Daniel Hayes who had saved her had come from a timeline where Earth was destroyed by the Dominion, and where he had escaped on an experimental ship that was fleeing the destruction, but by saving Earth she had prevented that future from happening. She said that in this new timeline Daniel would never need to travel back through time and never need to sacrifice himself, because Earth was safe and humanity was thriving, and the causal loop had been broken. Daniel felt relief wash over him, because the thought of having to eventually leave everything behind and go die in the past had been weighing on him, even though he had tried not to think about it too much. Seraphine said that this meant they were free to build whatever future they wanted together, without being bound by destiny or debt or temporal paradoxes, and that the choice was entirely theirs. Daniel pulled her close and kissed her, and she kissed him back, and somewhere in the distance made a sound that might have been approval or might have been amusement or might have been both. When they finally pulled apart, Seraphine was smiling in a way that made her look genuinely happy and young despite her 700 years, and she said that she had a proposal to make. She said that as Empress she had duties that required her to travel throughout the eternal realm, visiting different worlds and meeting with different leaders, and that these journeys could take months or even years. She said that she would like Daniel to come with her and see the galaxy and meet her people and be by her side as her partner and companion. Daniel said that he would love that more than anything and that Earth would be safe with Maya and the joint fleet watching over it, and that it was time for him to start a new chapter of his life. They spent the rest of the day making plans and talking about all the worlds they would visit and all the things they would see together. And as the sun set on Earth far below them, they knew that their story was just beginning. The war with the Dominion had ended, and the alliance between humanity and the Eternal Realm had been forged, and now two people from completely different worlds and completely different timelines had found each other against all odds. In the gardens of the Starlight Palace, under the light of alien stars, Daniel Hayes and Empress Seraphine stood together and looked toward a future that neither of them could have imagined just a few months ago. An ancient and wise beyond measure closed his eyes and smiled, because he knew that sometimes the best stories were the ones where love conquered even the barriers of time and space and destiny. The real adventure was just beginning, and the galaxy would never be quite the same.